The brisk morning air filtered through the automatic doors of Los Angeles International Airport, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of hurried footsteps. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, glinting off the polished floors as travelers bustled to and fro, their voices weaving into a tapestry of pre-flight chaos. Among the crowd, Barron Trump stood near Gate 12, his tall frame leaning casually against a column, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Despite his stature and the whispers his name often provoked, he blended into the scene, his sharp features softened by the calm he exuded. Barron's gaze shifted from his phone to the check-in counter as raised voices disrupted the hum of activity. An elderly man in his late 70s stood at the desk, clutching a weathered leather duffel bag. His silver hair was neatly combed, his military jacket adorned with faded patches and medals that told silent tales of valor. His posture, though slightly hunched, carried an air of quiet dignity. "I understand," the veteran said, his voice calm yet strained. "I'll find another flight." The gate agent, a young woman whose professional smile faltered under the weight of his disappointment, shook her head apologetically. "I'm so sorry, sir. We're fully booked, and I don't have any seats left in economy. The next available flight is tomorrow." The veteran nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He turned, stepping aside to allow the next passenger to approach the counter, but the slump in his shoulders betrayed his disheartenment. Barron watched the interaction unfold, his brow furrowing. There was something about the man's quiet acceptance that tugged at him, a sense of respect mixed with an unshakable feeling of responsibility. He stepped forward, weaving through the throng of passengers, his sneakers scuffing lightly against the floor. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice carrying a steady authority despite its calmness. The gate agent looked up, startled to find herself face to face with Barron Trump. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but he ignored it, his attention fixed on the veteran who stood just a few feet away. "Could I give him my seat?" Barron asked simply. The gate agent blinked, her surprise evident. "Your seat, sir? In first class?" "Yes," Barron said, his tone unwavering. "He deserves it more than I do." The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of those nearby. Murmurs began to ripple through the waiting area as passengers turned to witness the exchange. The veteran, hearing the commotion, looked up in confusion. "You don't have to do that, young man," the veteran said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of humility. Barron met his gaze, his expression resolute. "I want to. Please, let me." For a moment, the veteran hesitated, his weathered hands tightening around the strap of his duffel bag. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Barron turned back to the gate agent, who was now visibly moved. "Can you arrange it, please?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Right away." As Barron stepped aside to allow the arrangements to be made, the murmurs in the crowd swelled. Travelers exchanged astonished glances, some pulling out their phones to capture the moment. But Barron paid no attention to the growing buzz, his focus entirely on ensuring the veteran's comfort. What began as an ordinary morning at the airport was now charged with a sense of shared awe, the seed of a story that was only beginning to unfold. As the boarding process concluded, the veteran eased into the plush seat in first class, his calloused hands brushing against the armrests as if testing whether the comfort was real. His jacket, adorned with patches of valor, stood out amidst the luxury of the cabin. He adjusted himself cautiously, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. In economy, Barron Trump folded his tall frame into a cramped window seat, his knees brushing the seat in front of him. He reopened the hardcover book he had been reading earlier, seemingly unbothered by the downgrade. Around him, whispers and curious glances grew, passengers murmuring about the young man's unexpected gesture. "Isn't that Barron Trump?" a woman whispered to her husband in row 22. "Yeah," he replied, glancing toward Barron. Did you see what he just did? First class for a vet? That's something you don't see every day. The flight attendants began their service, distributing drinks and snacks as the plane reached cruising altitude. In first class, the veteran sipped a glass of water, his eyes scanning the window as clouds drifted below. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a small pin on his lapel. A purple heart. His gaze lingered on it for a moment before he turned to the woman seated beside him, a middle-aged business traveler with kind eyes. "I'm sorry to interrupt, ma'am," he began, his voice carrying the steady but weathered tone of someone accustomed to long silences. "But I feel like I need to say something." The woman turned toward him, curious. "Of course," she replied, her tone warm and encouraging. The veteran cleared his throat, glancing briefly toward the back of the plane where Barron sat. "That young man back there, he gave me this seat. But what he doesn't know is, his family saved my life once, a long time ago." The woman's brows furrowed in surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. The veteran leaned back, the faint hum of the engines underscoring his words. "It was after I came back from Vietnam," he began. "I was injured, lost my way for a while. No direction, no purpose. Ended up in New York, barely scraping by. One night I was sitting outside a diner, trying to figure out my next move, when a man stopped and talked to me. Sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Fred Trump, Barron's grandfather." Passengers nearby, who had been discreetly listening, now leaned in closer. The veteran continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Fred Trump didn't just offer me $1 or a meal. He gave me a job and a place to stay. He told me, you serve this country. It's the least we can do." Those words stayed with me my whole life. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin as the story reached them. A flight attendant passing by stopped, her tray of drinks momentarily forgotten as she listened. "I always wanted to thank his family," the veteran said, his voice softening. "But life happened, and I never got the chance. And now, all these years later, his grandson, without even knowing the connection, has done something I'll never forget." The business traveler beside him blinked rapidly, her own eyes glistening. "That's incredible," she whispered. Around them, murmurs grew as passengers shared the story with one another. The revelation sparked a cascade of reflections. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter. "Kindness like that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's rare, and it runs in their family." Across the aisle, a man in his 40s nodded, his expression contemplative. "My dad always said it's the little things that pull people through," he murmured. "This proves it." Back in economy, Barron was oblivious to the growing buzz. His book remained open, his eyes scanning the pages, but his focus wavered as he noticed passengers occasionally glancing his way. He offered polite nods to those who smiled at him, but otherwise remained composed, unaware of the full impact of his gesture. In first class, the veteran sat in reflective silence, his story still resonating through the cabin like a quiet ripple in a still pond. One of the flight attendants, visibly moved, approached him. "Do you want me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked softly. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Let him have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." Passengers exchanged glances, many wiping their eyes discreetly. What had started as a small act of kindness had now transformed the flight into something extraordinary, a shared moment of humanity that would stay with everyone long after they landed. As the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing the plane's descent into Newark, the atmosphere in the cabin was anything but routine. Passengers adjusted their belongings. The overhead bins clicked shut, but an unspoken energy lingered in the air. Something deeper than the usual pre-landing anticipation. In first class, the veteran sat quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. Then, as if resolving something within himself, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his movements deliberate. The flight attendant closest to him stepped forward, concerned. Is everything all right, sir? She asked softly. The veteran nodded. Yes, I just need to speak with that young man. Her eyes followed his toward the back of the plane, where Barron sat, still immersed in his book. The flight attendant stepped aside, watching with admiration as the veteran made his way down the narrow aisle, steady despite the subtle turbulence. Passengers turned, their curiosity piqued as the veteran approached Barron's row. When he stopped beside him, Barron looked up, surprised. Slowly, he closed his book and stood, his height making the veteran crane his neck slightly. You didn't have to do what you did, the veteran began, his voice firm yet warm. But you did it anyway, and I want you to know just how much it meant to me. Barron nodded humbly, his expression thoughtful. You deserved it, sir, he replied, his voice quiet but sincere. It's the least I could do. The veteran extended his hand, and Barron clasped it firmly. I don't think you realize, the veteran said, his voice trembling slightly, but your family has a history of kindness. Your grandfather gave me a second chance when I thought I'd lost everything. And today, you reminded me of that. You've honored his legacy more than you know. Barron's lips parted in surprise, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He nodded, his grip on the veteran's hand tightening slightly. Thank you, he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet gravity, for telling me, and for everything you've done for this country. The exchange was brief but profound, the kind that left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. Passengers nearby wiped at their eyes, some smiling through tears. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned toward Barron. You've got a good heart, kid, he said. The world could use more of that. Others chimed in, offering words of gratitude to the veteran and admiration for Barron's actions. The plane had become a microcosm of shared humanity, a fleeting yet unforgettable moment of unity. As the wheels touched down on the runway, the veteran returned to his seat, his steps lighter than before. Barron, still processing the exchange, sat back down, his gaze distant as if replaying the veteran's words in his mind. Once the plane taxied to the gate, Barron stood to retrieve his bag. Before stepping off the aircraft, he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen before typing a short message to his family. Grandpa would have been proud today. His kindness lives on. As he exited the jet bridge, the morning sun filtering through the terminal windows, Barron's steps were steady but purposeful, a quiet determination in his posture. Around him, passengers whispered and exchanged smiles, their spirits buoyed by what they had witnessed. This story reminds us that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to ripple outward and touch lives in ways we cannot predict. Compassion and gratitude bridge the gaps between generations, social statuses, and life experiences, creating bonds that endure. Let this be a reminder to look for opportunities to uplift others, whether through a kind word, a selfless gesture, or simply acknowledging someone's humanity. Kindness matters. Pass it on. Thank you for watching this heartwarming story that reminds us of the power of kindness and compassion. If this inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories like this one.